In case any of you were concerned that I ever stop thinking about morphology, I have evidence that I never stop thinking about morphology. So I took my son and 20 of his friends to Kung Fu Panda 4 for the birthday. And there was this clip in the show. And I was like, if this isn't a sign that I need to do something with plurals, I don't know what is.
Oh, you have never faced anything like this.
The chameleon is the power of all my old nemesises. Nemesi?
So what is the plural of nemesis? Nemesises? Nemesi? Nemesis? And you'll find that as we explore different words, that we have these things called complex plurals. They also have, of course, the word irregular attached to them because we can't help ourselves. And in fact, complex plurals are part of, I believe, grade 4 in the curriculum. I think it shows up in grade 4. It might also show up in grade 3. I can't quite remember. So when we're talking about complex plurals or irregular plurals, although I don't like using that term, it's usually not irregular. It just has a story that we might not be familiar with. We're talking about plurals who are formed with something other than ES or S. So if you look at the little, well, both the first line and the little sticky note there, ES has been written. So the E is in brackets because the ES is the full form of the plural. But most of the time we use the shortened form, which is the S. Now, I think I've shared this tidbit before, and we don't have time to get into the meat and potatoes of things here, but a lot of spelling programs or structures give students a very long list. It's not that long, but there's a list of like, if a word ends in CH, X, blah, 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 then we add EAS, and all the other times we add an S. Okay. That is not true. So the best or easiest way to think about when we add S or ES is if when you look at the base or the single form and you compare it to its plural form, if you've increased in syllables, you've added an ES. Now there's other pieces around if your base is changed, like from loaf to loaves, then you've added an ES. But if you think about the word horse, horse has 1 syllable, horses has 2 syllables, you have added an ES. But because horse ends in an E, it appears as though all we've done is added an S. Why does this matter in the great scheme of life? Well, we don't teach children that if a base word ends in an E and we add an ED ending, that we just throw a D on the end. We explain to them that the E of the base gets dropped and the ED gets added. So you can have that same conversation with ES. So please note that there are resources out there that are wrong around word sorts on whether we're adding ES or S to them. Moving forward with the topic at hand. So ES is not native to English. It didn't exist in Old English, but interestingly enough, it is now the only productive plural suffix in English. And I know what you're going to say. What is a productive plural suffix? I'm glad you asked because I had to Google it. What it means is it's the only one that we currently use to make plurals. So if a new word comes into English and we anglicize it, we will make it plural by adding the ES or S. There are times in, and I'm going to get into this, words that we borrow, loan words from other languages, where we don't see plurals being formed by using the ES or S. But in general, if I was going to make some kind of a general statement, I would say that if a new word was invented today and it needed to be made into a plural, it would be made into a plural with either es or s. It would not be using these complex structures that we're going to talk about today, because all these complex structures that we're going to talk about come from, for the most part, Old English and older. So we've just inherited them. Win or lose, it's one of those situations where, like, what's the reason? Well, here's the reason. You might think it's a stupid reason, but it's still the reason. Okay. So we didn't have es as a structure to form plurals back in Old English times. What did we do instead? Well, instead, we did things like shift the vowel. So moving from foot to feet, or goose to geese. That's how we showed plural back in the Old English times. Sometimes we added an en as a plural. We don't see a lot of that. That's like followed words along, but that was a structure. And sometimes they did it all. They do a vowel shift and they added an en. So we see brother being pluralized into brethren. So we had a shift from the O to the E, and then we added an en as well. Double whammy. Okay. So a lot of the words that we see come from Old English, which was inspired by German, Old German. So you might see lists like this one of Germanic plurals from Old English. And so we've already talked about that vowel shifting. Another thing that they sometimes did was the CE, and there's only a handful of those words where we go from louse to lice, mouse to mice. Friends, this one blew my mind. Penny to pence. Pence is the plural of penny. So something's 12 pence. It's 12 pennies. Mind blow. That was like, how did I not, sometimes you realize things at your age and you're like, how did I make it this far in life without knowing that fun fact? And ta-da, now I know it. And then when we see words like woman and man, again, that's just an example of another one of those vowel shifts, right? The A to the E. And so we have a handful of words that follow, some of those three structures that I mentioned earlier. And it comes from their Germanic background. And apparently, these are still things that you can see with plurals in German. I also don't speak German, so I can't speak to that. But if anyone out there's a German speaker, perhaps you can attest to the fact that this is still done in German. I'm not sure exactly. Now, in my quest for more information, I also came across, of course, words that remain unchanged in their plural form. Some of these words remain unchanged because they are loan words from another language. So moose, for example, is an indigenous word. It's Algonquin. And it was one moose or many moose. That's how it was in the language. And so we didn't change it to mooses. If we were going to anglicize it now, that's what we would do. And it's not from Old English. So that's why we don't say moose becomes meese. So, those little rhymes that are like, why is this, and this, but not this? Well, I'll tell you why, because it's not from the same language. Aircraft was one that I thought was really interesting because that's a relatively modern word. But you can have one aircraft or 15 aircraft. There's no aircrafts. And this one here, and this is my, like there's sometimes when people make mistakes in their speaking and it's like nails down a chalkboard. Lego is mine. Lego is singular and plural. There are no Legos, friends. Lego. And if you want to know why, you can read a very long-winded explanation on their website about branding and brand maintenance. But the Lego gods would like you to only refer to Lego singular and plural with Lego. And fish can be plural as fish, but we also have the word fishes if we're talking about more than one species. So these are just, I think, fun conversations, and you can have your students go and figure out, where did all these words come from? Do we see any patterns in them? I thought maybe they were all borrowed from like as loan words, but then like salmon comes from, I think it's like Scots, which I guess would be a loan word from back in the day. I'd have to dig into it further, but I thought that was really interesting. Also, some words don't have a singular, which was kind of fun. So you will always have trousers. You will never have trouser. I saw someone the other day on the Twitter who's like, we know it's a pair of scissors. Can we just like not anymore? Anyways, why is it the pair of scissors or a pair of shears? We know it's a pair. What is the pair? Anyways, it was a very funny little, and of course people are talking and buying into this conversation, which was probably just for clicks and likes. But like poultry is always plural. And things I've never thought about. Police. Okay, interesting. And some words look like plurals, but are actually singular, which again, this files into that fun fact category as opposed to actual useful information. But it could be a fun conversation to have with your students and then say like, hey, can we think of any other words? Or, you know, maybe we're just going to have a running list somewhere. And when we come across another word that we think is a plural, but it's actually a singular, like let's do some investigating, see what we can figure out. The one that made me laugh was measles. And I was like, right, because I've never heard of a measle. You have the measles. And maybe, Julie, you're onto something. Mathematics referring to all of the areas of math combined. But it's considered a singular word as opposed to a plural word. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the complex plurals that you're going to come across. Thankfully, these actually fall into some really nice little categories that you could do some word study and word sorts with your students to help them understand some of the patterning. So if we have a word that is of a Latin origin, then if it ends in the endings on the left in the singular column, then how we make it plural is listed on the right. So alga becomes algae, which of course it does because we know about algae. Cactus, cacti. Radius, radii. Stimulus, stimuli. Vertebra, vertebrae. Matrix, matrices. There's a lot more words that would fit in this sort. So the little pencils at the bottom there are just a sample of words. Now, something that I thought was also quite interesting is some words have both a Latin and an English plural. So we talk about multiple formulae in a math science context, but multiple formulas in other contexts. So it's possible, you know, when the grammar police arrest you and they're like, actually, it's not formulas, it's formulae. It could be possible that it is, in fact, formulas. So there are other, that's just one example. And again, you could have your students do some digging. Is it possible that there's cactus, cacti, and cactuses? I don't know. I would have to go do some investigating and see what I could discover. When you have words that are coming from a Greek place, background, origin, that's the word I'm looking for. From IS, we go to ES, and ON becomes an A. So phenomenon becomes phenomena, analysis, analyses, basis, bases, axis, axes, hypothesis, hypotheses. So for the most part, for us, I would say we have heard these complex plurals. I've personally never had anyone break it down for me in this way, that if it comes from this origin, then this is the pattern. But I think it would be a really simple way to explore complex plurals with your students. And thankfully, when I look at the Greek list and I look at the Latin list, we don't have another, like we don't have a crossover here, because sometimes there's crossover between Latin and Greek. So it becomes a really simple plural, sorry, a really simple word sort. The spelling of basis, bases, looks like bases, B-A-S-E-S. So it becomes actually a tier 2 word that, depending on the context, could mean like I'm running the bases at the baseball diamond, or there are many bases for his conclusion. So that becomes one of those situational words where we change the stress timing of the word to show where it comes from. But as you're reading, they're spelled the same. And so we'd have to have some context in order to make sure that we are effectively comprehending what it is that we're reading.
So
And
Charlie,
yes,
sorry, to spell out that word then, bases, would it be with the ES then?
B-A-S-E-S. And it looks just like bases.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Weird, right? That's a little, or as I like to say, interesting. There's a handful, and like literally a handful, and depending on the complexity of the books that your kids are reading, an unlikelihood that they're going to interact with these words. Maybe in your drama class where you're doing a series of tableaux, and so we spell it with an X to show that it's plural. So there's a handful of French words that we've borrowed, and through the borrowing maintained the French pluraling structure, which is adding that X on the end. So, you know, maybe I go somewhere and I see multiple plateau. I don't see plateauses. That's not the word. Chateau is another one that, if you happen to be, you know, exploring the Loire Valley and you're looking at multiple chateau, you will find some English like sites and stuff that say chateaus with an S on the end, and that is wrong, you're wrongerson. So hold on to your hats, folks, because there are 2 times where you can actually use an apostrophe for plurals. Very rarely is that going to happen at the grocery store or on a menu. So anytime you see those, feel free to correct those people, because they are probably wrong. But if you are talking about a really short word and it's out of its grammatical context and you need to create some clarity, you can use an apostrophe S so that people can recognize that you're pluraling that tiny word. Also, if you're talking about the plural of a single letter, so don't forget to dot your I's, we would put an apostrophe there so that we didn't confuse that with is. Don't forget to dot your is. Wouldn't make any sense. Once upon a time, I know I was taught that you would also use an apostrophe for plurals for abbreviations, like DVDs. Remember those? Or dates. And while you can still technically do that, most style guides suggest that you get rid of the apostrophe. So it would just be DVD with an S. There'd be no apostrophe. Or if I'm talking about the 1920s, it would be 1920 with an S. There would be no apostrophe to talk about a date. Okay. We've got a few minutes left. What about the spelling of children? We're going to go on a little historical walk, friends. This is where sometimes the etymology is super helpful. Once upon a time in Old English, the word child was singular and plural the same, just like deer and salmon, moose and Lego. It was singular and plural, spelt the same. And this is what it would have looked like. I don't even attempt to speak Old English, but there is a little, there's a website I use sometimes when I'm really trying to figure it out. Okay, so then we fast forward a little bit, and they moved along and eventually added a letter U to represent the plural form of child. Okay. In early Middle English, they converted the U to an RE for its plural. So we still had child. And then for the plural form, it would be, again, I don't speak early Middle English, childra. I don't know. My guess is that the sound maybe had something to do with the way they pronounce that U, but that is like a stabby stab in the dark. Then in Southern British English, they decided that that wasn't enough. And so they added the EN on to the early Middle English pluralization. Because remember, they do that brother to brethren, right? So what we end up having in our present day spelling is a double plural of the word child. So we have child plus the pluraling of Middle English plus the pluraling of a later English of the EN to get the form children. They think that there's a connection in the spelling of like brethren, that REN piece, because they also used to say sistren for like plurals of sister women, I guess. I don't know. Sisters, I guess. And so they think they might have like paralleled the building of that a little bit to get there. So when we're looking at the spelling of children, it's really, really plural. There's two suffixes being added on it to make it plural. All right, now we can have a little bit of fun in the final minute together. Friends, what's the plural of octopus? Don't worry, I also got this wrong. It's not a trick question.
Is it octopusi?
Nope. Lots of people say
Octopi.
See, you were on the right track, Wanda. Susan's almost there. So I, like forever and a day, was told that the plural of octopus was octopi. That is actually incorrect. So here's what happened. Once upon a time in the spelling of English, we were doing some work where we wanted to like get back to our Latin roots. And so they misidentified the word octopus coming from a Latin origin. It doesn't, it comes from Greek. And so the pie, the puss to the pie is Latin. That is not what it is. So technically, the plural would be octopodes if it was coming from Greek. However, the most agreed upon spelling for the plural of octopus is octopuses, which sounds ridiculous. But it was quite funny because I had this conversation. My husband allowed me a very brief morphological conversation at the dinner table the other night. And we started talking about this. And my son, later on, he's like, so Mom, is the plural of cactus actually cacti, or did they get that wrong too? And I said, nope, they got that one right. So that was kind of an interesting thing, I thought. The Italian singular suffix O becomes an I. So these words are already pluraled. Spaghetti, graffiti, confetti. If you find a singular piece of confetti, you've actually found a confetto. If you have one piece of spaghetti, you've got spaghetto. How How fun is that? Maybe only in my mind. Okay. I realize that we're heading out over time. My apologies. I do have this in the slides, so you could do this with your students, but you could talk about where they think these words might come from based on how their plurals are spelled. So here we have this vowel shift. Where do you think it came from if you know that it has a vowel shift? Well, we've had a conversation, and I'm pretty sure that means it came from Old English. Here we have an IS going to an ES. That I believe is Greek. We have a US going to an I. I think that's Latin. We have an EAU going to an EAUX. That would be French. All right, so friends, here's your homework. Can you find any more examples of complex plurals? I'm sure they're out there. You could ask your students to look for them in their own reading. As with all word study, we're looking for patterns. So do they notice patterns about where these words are coming from? Maybe they're going to find some more examples of vowel shifting that are occurring, and maybe they're not from Old English. Maybe they've got a German history background in their language. Maybe that's a connection. And I'm just riffing here. I have no idea if that would be a pattern that they would come across.